If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
For the past few months, right-to-work legislation has dominated the Missouri General Assembly's agenda. And even though it didn't make it past the finish line in veto session, State Representative Eric Burlison has a plan to bring it back next year. The Springfield Republican joins us next on another edition of Politically Speaking.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I think that is fair to say.
Hands to kiss and babies to shake. But
I think my record speaks for itself.
That's a really good question.
Hello and welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. I'm welcoming back my colleague who has been transversing across the East Coast.
For 2.5 weeks. Yeah, this is Jo Mannies, also with St. Louis Public Radio.
Sorry to interrupt. This is the first thing that she's done since she's been back on her well-deserved vacation. And joining us from the beautiful KSMU studios in Springfield, Missouri, we have as our special guest today,
this is Eric Burlison,
a state representative from Springfield, a Republican. Welcome to our show. I believe you are the first Springfield legislator of any kind to appear on our show.
Well,
and he's an up-and-comer in the State House.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's good. It's about time that people in St. Louis realize that there is a Springfield on the west side.
Oh, we do.
We certainly know, but I think St. Louis just sees Springfield as the place in Illinois where the Illinois legislature fails all the time. The Springfield, Missouri, Springfield, I think is a bit more prosperous and successful than the one in Illinois.
Yes, it's the home of Missouri State University.
That's right.
And it's also the third largest. Well, depending on how you count, it's at least the third largest community in Missouri. Some say it's actually second, but the point is that it's one of the top three.
Yeah, and we've got the largest school district, I think, at this point.
Yeah, I would imagine so. But before we get into any issues, because we have a lot to talk about after the veto session, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into Missouri politics.
Well, I'm mostly a software computer nerd by trade. I grew up in Southwest Missouri, and really in the back door, in the shadows of what is now Bass Pro, the big Bass Pro headquarters.
The gigantic Bass Pro.
Yeah,
that's huge. Takes days to go through it. I've been there.
And so we're really proud of what Johnny Morris has done, and I grew up watching that business grow, and went to Missouri State and got a degree and I got a master's in business administration, and my undergraduate is actually in philosophy, which did not serve me very well whatsoever in the private sector, but has served me fairly well in my legislative career.
I bet.
How so? I'm curious. How does a degree in philosophy help you navigate the treacherous waters of Jefferson City?
It is really interesting because there's often times where I'm reminded about debates or subjects that we read about or studied, and particular thoughts and theories that would never have come up in private conversation, but. For example, I remember as we're talking about the criminal code or other things, I was reminded of Ferdinand Schumann and discussing retributive justice versus rehabilitative justice, and it's often that issues come up that remind me of things that I learned about in my undergraduate.
So how long you want to talk about when you got elected and sort of how you ended up wanting to get into politics in the first place?
Yeah, growing up, my grandfather was active he was a Democrat, and my grandmother was very strong Republican, and going to Thanksgiving dinners was always really interesting because my uncle, who is locally, he was served on city council and was probably one of the first, if not, very few elected libertarians in the area. In the Midwest.
Wow.
And so our family...
Multicultural background.
Yeah. So, as a kid growing up, I heard at Thanksgiving dinners, we didn't talk about sports. We talked about politics. And so I was always fascinated by it, but really inspired by my grandmother and my father, really, who was an entrepreneur, and I really thought that saw all the struggles that he went through trying to build his business, and decided that was really what I believed in most was the American spirit of someone who takes that risk, who wants to build more, and I really thought that that's really what grows the economy, is the people that are willing to do that, take that risk. So I started volunteering for candidates that I liked. And one of the candidates I really admired was Norma Champion, and so she was a state representative at the time, and I ended up becoming an intern for her in 1999, along with, at the same time, Adam Crumbliss, who is now the chief clerk of the House. He and I were both interning from Missouri State that year,
And yeah, just for our listeners, Norma Champion is a legendary broadcaster in Springfield. I believe that she was nicknamed Aunt Norma, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and she ended up being in the state Senate
for, I think, 8 years, and I think was actually inducted into the Missouri Broadcasters Hall of Fame, and I think she has a doctorate in communications. So very fascinating political figure and woman, but continue, Representative.
She was great to know, and she was one of the wisest people that I've ever known, and she there's still to this day some things that I remember her saying to me when I was interning or even first getting elected. And one of the most special honors that I had was that the first 2 years that I was in office, I was able to overlap and share with her while she was in the Senate. So her last 2 years in the Senate, I was able to serve my first 2 years in the House.
So you were elected in 2008. You succeeded Representative B.J. Marsh in the House, if I'm correct on that.
Yeah, and that's actually, B.J. Marsh is really when I started making that transition of, do I want to run for office? Because as you may remember, B.J. Marsh he had a lot of heart issues while he was in office. And I remember one night, and I don't know that I've ever said this publicly, but basically one night B.J. Marsh was having a procedure in Texas, a very experimental heart procedure, and someone from the local Republican Party asked me to meet them at a Hardee's at 9 o'clock at night. And I didn't know why. I was just I work as a software engineer and volunteer for campaigns, but they asked me to consider, if something were to happen, would I consider running for B.J. Marsh's seat or taking the nomination from if something were to happen. And things were not looking very good for Representative Marsh. And it really hit me. I never thought of myself as someone that could run for office. I've always really didn't see myself that way. I've always been more of a introvert, policy nerd, software engineer. I don't spend my days going I just am not a person that walks into a room and takes over the room. I'm usually the wallflower in a room, and so it meant a lot to me that someone would think that of me, and so it started me on a journey of exploring it and talking with my wife about it before I decided to run.
And then you ended up winning the seat. It was I think you won about 57-43, and I don't think you have faced a competitive election since. And since that time, you become the chairman of the House Professional Licensing and Registration Committee. And I think that some passive followers of the Missouri Capitol may think that's not that big of a deal, but in actuality, it is one of the most important committees maybe in the Missouri legislature if you're an industry that is regulated by the state. Is that a correct summation, or am I kind of overblowing your your role in the Missouri House
No,
there.
I think you're very right. In fact, when I first came in, I was advised that that's the number one committee that you want to get on, and that it's extremely important. And to me, when I first saw it, it sounded like, a boring committee, but it is a very fascinating committee. We regulate everything from doctors and nurses and cosmetologists to professional wrestlers. And if you have a job, and when at the end of the day, when government is writing rules and regulations that affect your livelihood and your career, you care very much about those issues. And so I often stress to the committee how important it is that the decisions that we make are, because they directly affect people's livelihoods.
And from what, do you get lobbied by every conceivable industry known to man based on your committee chairmanship? Because from what I recall, the other people that were chairman of this committee, it seemed like it was they became kind of an important political figure in the Missouri House just by the virtue of that position. So do you ever get any sleep because every industry wants your take on something, essentially?
Yeah, it is somewhat like, there's a lot of different groups, and until I got elected and served on this committee, I had no idea how many associations there were. But there is an association for everything, and all of those associations have membership, and they are able to, what they typically do with a lot of that is pay for lobbyists who then their job is to look out for what issues are affecting those people's careers. So it is really interesting, and it's also never boring. Every year there's issues that are different. This year we had a lot of funeral issues, and I never thought that I would be chairing a committee deciding when somebody dies, who is going to be responsible for making the decisions over what to do with the corpse. But that is, that's one of the issues that we had this year. We have had issues related to who can sell unpasteurized milk or who can sell unbaked goods. We've had issues where people that sell hearing aids, whether or not they have to go to a 2-year school or get a 4-year degree. So you name it. If it has something to do with somebody's career, then our committee generally examines those issues.
It is a fascinating committee, and I've known for a while how prominent it is. It plays in the Missouri legislature. But let's shift gears to something that kind of involves Missouri businesses, and that's right-to-work legislation. For our listeners, Representative Burlison was the House sponsor of right-to-work, which, Joe, as you always do, could you just explain what right-to-work is?
Okay, the right-to-work bill in Missouri would have barred unions and employers from requiring all workers in a bargaining unit to pay fees or dues. In essence, that's what it is.
That is essentially what the shorthand means. Now, Representative Burlison, this bill made it farther than any other iteration of right-to-work legislation, probably in Missouri history. It passed the Missouri House. It passed the Missouri Senate after an acrimonious previous question. It was vetoed by Governor Jay Nixon, and it did not get enough votes in the veto session to be overridden. What was kind of your take on its trajectory this year?
It was great to see that we were able to finally get this issue, which from my area is the paramount issue. It's probably the most important issue to the community in Southwest Missouri, particularly as you go further southwest. It's even more important. In fact, today there was an article in the Joplin Globe about a meeting that was had between the Joplin Chamber and businesses, further stressing the importance of passing right to work, that they see it as the number one issue. So for us,
Can you explain for our listeners why you and your allies see this issue as being so important? since there really aren't any unions, very many in Southwest Missouri anyway. So I'm real interested, not just me, but many of our listeners are interested in this too.
Well,
explaining that.
So really, when we're out trying to get businesses to come, and we have a great labor force in this area. We have some of the best schools. We have Southwest Missouri State, or now Missouri State, and we have OTC and Missouri Southern, and we've got a very educated workforce, but we're getting turned down again and again, and we're seeing manufacturing and other jobs leave. And particularly in this area, when you talk to people in the trades who they're getting jobs, but they're traveling. Most of the jobs are on the other side of the state line. And so it becomes pretty evident the impact that this one piece of regulation has. And really, what it really boils down to is, for an employer, is it's a risk. So if you are trying to compete in a global economy and you're trying to figure out where you're going to place your new plant, or you're going to start a business, you want to reduce as much possibility of risk as possible, or uncertainty as possible. And so you're going to look at all of the federal and state and local regulations. You're going to look at the tax base. What are the property taxes? What is their personal property taxes? What are their energy costs in that area? Is there a workforce available? And having to deal with another level of uncertainty for a lot of businesses is I think what is the game changer for them. And that's why what we heard over and over again is that having right to work is not going to guarantee you that you're going to be picked as a site, but not having it is going to guarantee that you won't be in the running for a lot of businesses.
So we had as our guest last week State Senator Gina Walsh, a Democrat from Bellefonte and Neighbors, and is a former member of a labor union. I think she's still part of it. She heads the Building Trades Association for Missouri. And I asked her why, when she was in the Missouri House from 2002 to 2010, right to work wasn't a major issue, especially when Republicans controlled the legislature and the governor's mansion. Let's hear what she had to say about that.
Well, at that time, the governor himself said that he would not support a right-to-work issue, the Republican governor.
Matt Blunt, by the way.
Yes. And, I'm a Democrat. I've been a Democrat all my life. I'm also a labor person. And as a labor person, labor people know that issues like right-to-work does not have a political party attached to it.
So 2 questions there. I know that you weren't in the legislature when Matt Blunt was governor, but why do you think that this has become such a big issue in the legislature when the path to implementation is a lot harder with a Democratic governor? And 2, what was your reaction when I think almost 24 of your Republican colleagues in the House did not vote to override right to work?
So for me, this issue is one that I think the pressure and the reality is going to continue to build until it is passed, and you see that in the numbers. So when Governor Blunt was in office, the percentage of the workforce that was labor was a lot higher than it is today. We also had a higher population. We had a lot more people working in Missouri, and here we are 10 years later, and over the past 10 years since Governor Blunt was in office, we have seen the percentage and growth of our payroll in the private sector decline compared to the national average. We've seen a loss in jobs in those last 10 years, and we've seen the percentage of our workforce that is unionized decline greatly. So the status quo of forcing people into a situation, whether it's in their best interest or not, might be good for the labor boss, but at the end of the day, the economics of it and the results end up harming both, I think, labor unions and the state as a whole, because this issue is not just affecting the union population, which is now at around 8%, but it's affecting the other 92% as well. Because when we can't get companies to be excited about moving to Missouri unless we pay them with tax credits or other things from write checks from the Treasury, then we've got a problem. It doesn't hurt my feelings or affect me when I see colleagues vote in a way that serves their best interest or the best interest of their district. If they think that voting no is in their best interest, or especially the best interest of their district, then I respect that. I've not been one to twist arms. I don't have the clout to twist anyone's arms on an issue. From the very beginning, I felt like my role in this is not to be the person keeping a whip count, but really the person that's there to provide as much policy information and education as I possibly can, and to get as much of that information out as I can.
Now, you mentioned pressure. Where is most of the pressure coming from? Is it from donors? Is it from business groups? There are disputes over exactly what the figures are about whether or not the labor force was that much smaller during Blunt's years. It is true that the labor force that is in labor unions is about half of what it was in 1978 when it came up for a vote. But where is most of the pressure coming from?
I think you've got on outliers on both sides. You have pressure from the unions on of course on one side, and we heard a lot of that on the House floor. We heard from members that had decided after thoughtful consideration to vote for this, and we heard their stories of the pressure that they've received. I know that Representative Spencer had a billboard placed in his district immediately after voting, and then you have on the other side, to me, as an elected official, when you put your name on the ballot, you know what you're getting into, and anyone that thinks that running for office is a walk through a daisy field is really kidding themselves. It's an important job, and we make important decisions, and it's good that the public is paying attention, and that they but I also think that avoiding important issues because is not good. I think that we as elected officials, our job is to take on issues that are important and not be afraid to take on issues based on whether or not it's to avoid pressure.
Well, I wanted to ask about another aspect of pressure, and I'm going to have Senator Jamila Nasheed kind of lay it out for us. I was talking with her after the previous question of right to work occurred in May, and she had a theory on how it could impact the 2016 elections, especially the one for governor.
Many of them can go back home and say, look, we passed the right to work and the Democratic governor opposed it, and that's why we have to come out in droves and continue to control the House and the Senate and try to get the governor's mansion.
So it's been kind of assumed that this is going to become a major issue in the 2016 election, especially because the Democratic nominee, or the likely Democratic nominee, Chris Koster, the Attorney General, is adamantly opposed to right to work, and whoever comes out of the Republican field is going to be in favor of it. So my question for you is, do you expect right to work to come up next year in 2016, or is it really going to just kind of lay in limbo until the 2016 election for governor is decided?
Well, this has been an issue that, regardless of the politics, I've filed it year after year, and so it's my intention to file it, not only file it, but to pre-file the bill again. The need for it doesn't go away based on the vote, and so I'm gonna. I've been told year after year that it won't get out of the House, or that it won't get out of the Senate, and yet we've been able to make progress each year. And I think that, for me, the more that people evaluate it and think about it in a thoughtful way, I believe more people come to the conclusion that it is the right course or the right direction for the state. So for me, the more that we debate this issue, I think the better chance that the issue has.
Now, how crucial do you think it'll be, though, reiterating Jason's question, in the governor's race? I mean, so far, virtually all the major Republican candidates for governor have said that they support right to work.
Right.
Do you have any sense on how big of an issue it's going to be there?
Which is a game change for, that considering that years ago, as you mentioned, that people running statewide had a different perspective on the issue. And I think that it's the fact that we've had this discussion in both the House and Senate has, I think, caused a lot of the candidates to take the stand that they have, knowing that they've seen the House and the Senate move courageously on an issue that is very difficult and have a good, thorough debate on it. And I think that it has helped statewide candidates take the position that they have with more confidence than they have been willing to do so in years past. So I do think that it will have, obviously, it will have a significant role in the debates coming up, and it all has to do with how much do the national unions want to continue to get involved in the state, but I do think that that's going to play into it, is that you'll see that the national unions now, because the more that we tend to put off this issue, Missouri is the one that all the rest of the nation and those unions are kind of focusing on.
Right, and it'll definitely be, I think, a marquee issue in the gubernatorial race, and it could be another legislative issue next year. But we wanted to turn to an issue that is closer to us, but could be in the wheelhouse of the legislature soon, and that is the debate over the new football stadium in St. Louis. Now, even though Representative Burlison is a representative from Springfield, many legislators from all over the state have raised alarm over the prospect of Governor Jay Nixon essentially issuing state bonds for this project without a legislative or statewide vote. Before we get into the mechanics of that, what is kind of your take on the situation there? And do you think that the state legislature should be involved in whether they issue these bonds or not?
Yeah, my consistent view has been that it's not the role of government to invest taxpayer dollars in another business's enterprise. True capitalism is private sector investment and private sector gains or loss. That it's not, I don't see that the citizens of Springfield or even citizens of the rest of the state are receiving the financial dividends of the money that's being given to the owners of these sports franchises after they receive success. And so, while one could argue that there's a return on investment to the taxpayers, that I really believe that the best way to do that is to reduce taxes for everyone, and not do so by picking and choosing. And so, I think if it's owned by a private individual, I believe that the state should not be funding their enterprise.
So I would imagine that if the governor or the governor's administration issued bonds for this without the legislature's say, you may be one of the people who may vote against appropriating bond payments on this.
Yes,
like some of your colleagues. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's fair to say. And I think that it's disappointing that, for me, I want to at least have that debate. Whether or not it's appropriate for the state to be involved. I think that for the governor to obligate the citizens of Missouri to future payments to take out debt without a vote of the people, or without even a discussion of those that they elect, is is really disappointing to, and I think shameful to, the citizens of this state.
Well, I actually want to play a clip from Dave Peacock, who's one of the co-chairmen of the task force trying to bring a stadium in. And I asked him flat out what his opinion was on issuing bonds without a legislative or statewide vote. And he was, I would say, remarkably candid on his rationale for that. Here's what he had to say.
I also know that legislative votes can be challenging. And as much frustration as people have about one person extending bonds, I know at least in the Senate, one person can kill just about anything. And so if it's a question of one person keeping something alive and redeveloping our riverfront and growing our city, or one person killing it, I think I'd rather default to someone who's trying to lean forward.
Now, obviously, you're a member of the Missouri House, so you have no power to filibuster or anything. But when he said that, I was just imagining what the thought of legislators would be by his argument that getting something through the legislature is hard, therefore we should try it a different route. What's kind of your reaction to that mindset?
I think that it's ignoring. I think it's arrogance. To me, it's the height of arrogance to assume that you somehow are owed money, and that how dare an elected official elected by those taxpayers who are basically paying your bills, how dare that person stand in your way from taking money from the citizens that are paying you? So to me, there is a reason why we have the elected process. There's a reason why we have the Senate, this is the very reason that we should never allow people to gain access to the public treasury, and so that. To me, I think it is the height of arrogance to assume that they just have carte blanche access to what the taxpayers, not only that we have today, but for future generations to pay.
Now, looking ahead to the next legislative session, aside from right to work and potentially a fight over the stadium, what do you see as big issues that will be brought to fore? Do you think there will be another debate over Medicaid expansion, or maybe not? I know the Springfield area, there's been some turmoil over that. And I'm interested in your take on what other issues you think may be big when the General Assembly returns in January.
So I think transportation funding and making sure we have a strong infrastructure is going to be very important. I know that I've had discussions with the speaker on ideas for how we go about that without a tax increase. Last year, I filed a bill at the latter part of session. I think it was 1198, that would basically create a framework for long-term funding for the Department of Transportation, and it does so by taking over the payments. Or the salaries, pensions, and benefits of the workers within MoDOT, so that the money that they receive from the fuel taxes would go directly towards the construction, or basically go directly towards purchasing concrete, and the administrative costs would be paid for by out of the General Assembly, out of general revenue, and so we've explored some ideas about that, and then also some ideas of generating revenue without a tax increase by offering up opportunities to, say, farmers to harvest off of the right-of-way. I know that some people have explored allowing for naming rights of state roads, and then there's been a lot of creative ideas that are thrown out there to help.
So you don't see any possibility of the gas tax being increased next session?
I don't. While the General Assembly may go that direction, for me that's not a direction that I would support.
In our last few minutes here, we know that you sponsored legislation a couple years ago about a healthcare compact, which I think is something that some more Republican-leaning states are doing instead of expanding Medicaid. What do you kind of see on that front, given that, I guess, the window to get 100% free matching funds for Medicaid appears to have passed. It doesn't really seem like the Republican legislature has much appetite to expand the program under the auspices of the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, that was a bill that was one that I worked on and was the first in the country to draft, and now we have 11 states that have passed that same language, which as a lawmaker is one of the biggest honors that you can have. And so I've been hearing from presidential campaigns that they are examining the healthcare compact as something that those candidates will be potentially using as on their platform as the answer to
and just kind of explain what it is.
So the way the healthcare compact works is very similar to really what the Constitution is. The Constitution is a compact among states, and within the Constitution in Article 1, Section 10 and Clause 3, it allows for states to enter into a compact so long as the language of that compact does not exceed the scope of existing federal law. But once states have entered into a compact, then further or future federal regulation creates a shield of protection. So if we have a healthcare compact in place, then it would require federal law and not just federal regulation in order to change state law, if that makes sense. So
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So a lot of states are looking at this as a shield of protection against really what is, I think, grown the fastest is the bureaucracy of the federal government, and so that has been. And whenever you create that compact, you share ideas among states, and this would really be the way for states to do things such as allow purchasing of insurance across state lines, which really could not be done without some form of interstate compact because of the Commerce Clause.
Well, this has been really terrific. Thanks so much for joining us. I think a lot of our listeners will be very, very interested in what you have to say. As I've mentioned before, Representative Burlison is one of the rising stars in the Missouri House.
So thank you again for joining us. For all of our stories, stlpublicradio.org. You can follow me on Twitter at @Rosenbaum. You can follow Joe on Twitter at
J Mannies. That's JMANNIES.
And how would we follow you on Twitter, Representative?
Eric Burlison on Twitter.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Until next time, so long.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.